Welcome to today's presentation. My name is Alice Hogue, and I'll be your instructor. I thought we'd get started with a little Cajun joke, just to get everybody in a good mood. The two main characters in any Cajun joke are Boudreaux and Thibodeau. And I guess y'all want this with the accent, huh? Raise your hand if you want this with the accent. All right, so I'm going to hope y'all can understand the accent. Boudreaux and Thibodeau, they were, and they said, Thibodeau says to Boudreaux, Boudreaux, what you got there? And Boudreaux says, oh man, this is called a thermos, man. You never heard of a thermos? Then this is the greatest invention of all time. You use this when you go to lunch and you can put your food in there and it's just the best thing. And Thibodeau says, well, what's so great about it? And Boudreaux says, oh, man, it keeps hot things hot and it keeps cold things cold. And Thibodeau had never heard of that. He said, man, that's fantastic. He said, what you got in there right now, Boudreaux? He said, man, I got some chili and a popsicle. All right, so I thought we'd use that little joke to get started on our presentation on offshore leasing in the Outer Continental Shelf because it is a liquid that you could keep in your thermos if you wanted to. So today's presentation is offshore leases in the Outer Continental Shelf. And for those of you that are studying for the AAPL study guide, the CPL exam or the RPL exam, this is loosely based on Chapter 11 of the Land Reference Guide. Loosely based meaning I've looked at that chapter and I've determined what the most important parts of it are, and I've made sure to include those particular provisions in this presentation. So let's look at then what the agenda is for today. The first thing we're going to look at is we're going to look at an introduction. I want you to understand what the Outer Continental Shelf is, that it's not a term of ours that we've just kind of made up in the oil and gas industry. It's an actual physical geological structure. And then from there, I want to talk about the different laws and jurisdictions. You know, in the Outer Continental Shelf, up to a certain limit, the state has jurisdiction. So if you want to drill in that area, you need to get permission from the state. Beyond that area, the jurisdiction belongs to the federal government. So if you want to lease in the areas beyond, it's usually 3 nautical miles from the shoreline, then you need to approach the federal government. And then from there, I want to go over the process of offshore continental shelf leasing. We'll talk about what the leasing program is. And the organization that manages this is the Bureau of Ocean Energy Management, or the BOEM. And then how you go about leasing, what the leasing process is, how you go about leasing from the federal government or from the state government. And then we'll talk about joint bidding. That's when more than one company joins together in a single bid. Then we'll go through the lease terms, and if you're a successful bidder in the Outer Continental Shelf leasing process, then we'll wrap up with the conclusion. So for the lease terms, I want you to know that there's a minimum royalty in offshore leasing for the federal government, and that minimum royalty is a 3/16, 18.75. So that's what the royalty is. And then we'll wrap up with a conclusion. Now, in this particular webinar, I have a lot of images in this webinar. I really want you to see what we're talking about when we're talking about the Outer Continental Shelf. And so I had a lot of fun preparing this webinar because I was able to get a lot of the images and kind of demonstrate to you exactly what they're talking about in the laws. So I always say a picture's worth 1,000 words, and every picture needs a frame. So let's begin with what is the OCS? What is the Outer Continental Shelf? Well, the first thing I want you to recognize is that the Outer Continental Shelf is not some term that the oil and gas industry made up. It is an actual geological structure that surrounds all of the continents. All of the continents. You see, all the continents have a shallow extension of land mass and it's relatively shallow. It's tens of meters deep compared to the thousands of meters deep in the open ocean. It extends outward to the continental slope, and that's where the deep ocean truly begins. So it is a shallow extension of land. Here you can see the shallow extension of land around the continent, or the United States of America, the country. So it's kind of called a shelf. If you think about when you go into a swimming pool, you know, you get to a point where it's deep, and then all of a sudden there's a slope in it that gets even deeper. That's really what the outer continental shelf is. So you're in the shallow water, and then there's like a slope in that swimming pool. That's what the outer continental shelf is. So it's a shallow extension of that landmass adjacent to the shores of a particular state or country. So notice that we said state or country. And I'll show you the distinction between state outer continental shelf and federal outer continental shelf in just a second. But let's look now at what is the continental shelf. So just to give you an idea, this is a great diagram that I found of the continental shelf. So you can see 200 miles out, this is called the continental shelf. So this is like the shallow end of the swimming pool. And this is all considered the continental shelf. But once you have the slope, it's sort of like at the base of the mountain, if you will. But the outer continental shelf goes beyond that. So this is all considered the outer continental shelf, extended continental shelf, or the outer continental shelf. So in order to drill on this property, in this water, you're going to have to get permission from the federal government to do so. Anything beyond that area here, this becomes the international seafloor. That is, it is internationally owned by the United Nations. So I just want you to be familiar that this is an actual physical structure. So when we talk about the continental shelf and the outer continental shelf, you'll have a picture of what that is in your mind. So again, here's the continental shelf. It's 200-mile exclusive economic zone. And then you have the outer continental shelf. That's the piece that's owned by the federal government. And then beyond that, it's owned by the United Nations, or it's called international waters. So let's then look at this state jurisdiction. The state jurisdiction is from the coast to a distance of 3 nautical miles. Anything from that point is owned by the state, so that when the state issues an oil and gas lease, they're the ones that are going to derive revenue from those leases if it's within 3 miles of their coastlines. Now, there's a couple of exceptions, and so for most states, it's going to be 3 nautical miles. But if you look at a state like Texas or like Western Florida, that state jurisdiction is going to extend 10 nautical miles. So instead of just about 3 nautical miles, you're going to have 10 nautical miles for Texas and West Florida. So that's the state jurisdiction. Now the federal jurisdiction is anything beyond these 3 nautical miles for these states, or the 10 nautical miles for Texas and West Florida, extending 200 miles out to the sea. So I wanted you to understand first off in the introduction, we're going into more detail when we talk about laws and jurisdiction. But up front, I wanted you to recognize that there's 2 parties that own this land, the state and the federal government. It just depends on how far from the coastline it is to determine who has the actual ownership. So now let's look at another good diagram. This is from the Bureau of Ocean Energy Management, or the BOEM. So you'll see up to a certain point you can have private land. So remember when we talked about riparian rights in the legal descriptions webinar? Well, you can own out to a certain area, and that would be private lands, like on a beach, for example. But then 3 nautical miles from the coastline here, this is where we're talking about state jurisdiction. 3 nautical miles, or if it's Texas or Florida, it's going to be 10 nautical miles here. But that's going to be part of the continental shelf, but 3 nautical miles in is going to be the state jurisdiction. And then it's going to drop off, just like we talked about in that swimming pool. And so anything beyond 3 nautical miles for most states, is going to be owned then by the federal government under the Federal Submerged Lands Act. So that is going to be the federal ownership. So it's 200 nautical miles from the coastline that is considered federal land. Anything beyond that is called the international waters. I don't see that here, but that's what it's called. So I thought this next map was kind of interesting because it's fairly recent. It's April 12, 2012. This again comes from the Bureau of Ocean Energy Management website. I went out to their website just to see what I could find that would help us give you a picture of what's going on in this offshore leasing. But what it looks like to someone that's not an expert in the field, or even if you are an expert in your field or not familiar with the field, it just looks like a jangled mess. But what it is the green down here. These are showing currently active leases. These are leases that someone has taken from the federal government to develop this land, this subsea land. So each of these, if you can see, these are little bitty squares or little bitty blocks. That's why when you lease from the federal government, you're going to be leasing a certain block. And the lease itself will say block, whatever it is, in this. It's kind of like a township and range that they give out here. But it'll say what the block number is. And I think it's like A1, A2, A3, A4 in this certain blocks of the outer continental shelf. So that's the blocks part of it. So any of this could be leased, but only the ones in green are currently leased. And then here what you have is pipeline. Pipeline to get the oil or the gas to the coastline. And the different colors here represent the different diameters of pipe. Here, if you look, it says active oil pipeline 20 inches and greater. Active gas pipeline 20 inches is greater. So whether it's oil or gas and the diameter of that pipe. So those are all showing that they go out to, that the pipelines feed into the state lands so that then we can get the pipeline, we can get the minerals to the people. But what I wanted you to see was how if you look along the coastline of Louisiana, you can see that it's pretty small shoreline. So this is the 3 nautical miles here. But if you look at Texas, you can see clearly it's much bigger than what Louisiana's 3 nautical miles is. It's 10 nautical miles. And then the same thing over here. You see Louisiana. Here's Mississippi and Alabama. Again, we're still under this 3 nautical miles. But then once we get to Florida, again, Florida's interest is 10 nautical miles. So all those revenues then that are going to be within these 10 nautical miles are going to be revenue derived to the state of Florida or to the state of Texas. Within the 3 nautical miles, that's going to be for the state of Louisiana. So I just wanted you to kind of show you that to get you an idea. Now, I was talking about the blocks here. So for the blocks and leases that are off the coast of Louisiana, so this would be in 3 nautical miles for Louisiana. And these are different blocks, so Louisiana 2, 3, 3A, 3B, etc. So any leasing done on these lands, that's the state of Louisiana would derive revenue from that. And on the actual lease form, instead of a property description, it would say LA2, LA3, LA3B, 3C, whatever these blocks are notated. So that's just to give you an idea of what leasing on those lands would look like. So now I just wanted to show you again, here's another diagram of the boundaries. And again, you can see that Texas and Florida is a little bit bigger than Louisiana, Mississippi, and Alabama. Over here on Florida is like Texas, 10 nautical miles. This is just another good way to show you that. It also shows you, though, that the Bureau of Ocean Energy Management is divided into 3 different sections. So it's divided into the Western Gulf of Mexico, the Central Gulf of Mexico, and the Eastern Gulf of Mexico. So in the green is this U.S. 200 nautical mile limit. So that's beyond that is going to be the territorial seas. These are the boundaries, offshore administrative boundaries. And so now let's look at the impact of offshore drilling. So the impact of leasing offshore is, first of all, it provides the U.S. currently with 27% of our oil. So the United States is getting 20% of our oil right within the United States from this offshore leasing. And it currently provides 15% of the natural gas that we need, again, in the United States. But what they estimate in undiscovered potential has the possibility to dramatically change our dependence on foreign oil. And that is that there is undiscovered potential, which would be 60% of the need for oil in the United States and 41% of the need for gas. So we know that we have natural gas in abundance, especially with these shale plays that we now have. But oil is what we are still importing from, well, you've heard me say it before, from basically people that don't like us. So the possibility that there could be significant discoveries out there is what spurs us on to continue drilling out there. Even though it's very difficult, it can be very treacherous, because of the potential of us being able to recover 60% of the oil that we need. That is a huge motivator for us to continue to develop the Outer Continental Shelf. So the federal jurisdiction then for the Outer Continental Shelf is that it covers 1.76 billion acres, and the water depths can range from a few feet to thousands of feet in depth. So that's the federal jurisdiction. It's 1.76 billion acres that we could develop and avoid our dependence on foreign oil. Now I want to look at the laws and jurisdiction that affects this offshore drilling. First of all, the responsibility, the authority to manage the public land comes from the United States Constitution. And what it did is it vested the authority in Congress to manage the public lands. Congress then took that right and delegated it to the Secretary of the Interior, and the Secretary of the Interior then manages several different federal agencies. So let's look at those different federal agencies, and they are Department of the Interior manages the U.S. Department of the Interior, or the Bureau of Land Management. The United States Geological Services, the Department of the Bureau of Indian Affairs, U.S. Fish and Wildlife, and the Bureau of Ocean Energy Management. This is what governs the offshore, this Bureau of Ocean Energy Management. Now, one of the questions in your study guide is true or false. That is in your AAPL guide. And it says the BLM manages offshore leasing. Well, you can look here and see that clearly the BLM does not manage offshore leasing. Under the U.S. Department of the Interior, the Bureau of Ocean Energy Management is the agency that manages offshore drilling. So make sure you get that correct in your study guide if you're studying for the AAPL test. So it's the Bureau of Ocean Energy Management. So now, I'm a history major, so I like to know how these laws came into being. So let's look first at the laws that impact. One is called the Submerged Lands Act. That's also known as the SLA. And what it did is it granted coastal jurisdiction to the states. That is from the coastline to 3 nautical miles or 10 nautical miles, depending on which state it is. And then there's also another act called the Outer Continental Shelf Lands Act, or the OCSLA. That's what granted jurisdiction to the federal government beyond those 3 nautical miles, or beyond, for Texas, the 10 nautical miles. And then finally, we have 30 CFR, Title 30 of the Code of Federal Regulations, Section 250 and 256. This is what guides the process. This stands for Code of Federal Regulations. This was what guides the process to determine how to lease. It's under this Title 30. So let me just show you some pictures of these different acts. So what you see here is, first of all, the first thing you can see is Louisiana. Here is New Orleans here. So it's just showing you the different outer continental shelf, if you will. From this point out, it slopes into those deep waters that I was telling you about. Now this is after the BP oil spill. This was an environmental agency that placed sonars along the continental shelf. That's what all this is. These are sonars that were placed along the continental shelf so you could see if they wanted to see if the oil spill affected whale patterns. But you can clearly see from this that it does have this actual shelf. This is off the coast of Florida here, off the coast of Louisiana here. And you can see that there's a drop-off point, and then it gets into much deeper waters in the Gulf of Mexico. Again, those are known as the international waters, owned by the United Nations. This is another picture of Florida, where you can see, again, clearly the outer continental shelf. It's different lighting, but you can see this is clearly the outer continental shelf, and beyond that is the deeper or international waters. So again, here's the outer continental shelf. This is probably the 10 miles here, that state of Florida, but you can clearly see that there is an actual shelf here. Okay, one more for you. Now this is showing an earthquake that happened off the coastline of New Jersey and Long Island. And again, I just wanted to show you that there is an actual shelf, where there is a drop-off point. That is the outer continental shelf. Okay, so now I wanted to show you 30 CFR. It's one thing for me to just tell you what's in there, but I wanted you to know that this is actually codified online. So if you have any questions about leasing from the federal government offshore, all you need to do is to plug in 30 CFR section 250, and this is what I came up with. It's the mineral resources part of the Code of Federal Regulations, and it manages the oil and gas and sulfur operations in the outer continental shelf. So part A here, whose authority? This is where it answers those questions. What standards will a director use to regulate lease operations, etc.? What safety requirements are required? These are all what govern oil and gas leasing in the outer continental shelf. And, if your company wants to operate prudently out there or be a part of it, they can just go to 30 CFR and find out what the laws are that affect outer continental shelf leasing from the federal government. 30 CFR. So now let's look at the outer continental shelf leasing process. Well, first of all, the Bureau of Ocean Energy Management, or the Secretary of Interior, prepares an OCS leasing program. And what it is, it's just a schedule of leases conducted over a 5-year period. So this is the leasing program for the next 5 years. This is the 5-year plan. I got this right off of their website. And it'll say this is going to be the sale number. This is going to be the area that is going to be included in the lease sale. And this is the year that we're going to, for any leases that are interested in the western Gulf of Mexico, that's going to be 2012. Remember, that was near Texas. Central Gulf of Mexico, that's going to be, we're going to have an offshore leasing on that in 2013. That's going to be sale number 227. 233 is going to be the western Gulf of Mexico. We're also going to do that in 2013. So let's skip forward to 2014. We're going to do the eastern Gulf of Mexico, the central Gulf of Mexico, and the western Gulf of Mexico, all in 2014. So this just says what the 5-year program is. So from 2012 to 2017, it's telling you what parts of what different departments are going to have their leasing sale. So you see, these are really occurring every year, that they're having a sale in the Gulf of Mexico. So if you can imagine, the majority of OCS leasing and development is in the Gulf of Mexico. This, again, I looked online. This is the the Bureau of Ocean Energy Management website, www.boem.gov. And this is the proposed final Outer Continental Shelf oil and gas leasing program for the next 5 years. It's a 100-page document. And what it does is it goes through each area that's going to be for sale, what the environmental impact of that area is, and that will be posted online. Then your company can then get this online, and they can go through it and find out which of these areas will be leasing and which areas their geology is interested in leasing. So here's another picture of the Outer Continental Shelf. Each of these grids is a block number. So here's New Orleans is like up here. This is Venice, Louisiana. This is Grand Isle, Louisiana. This is Fouchon. My sister has a camp here in Fouchon, Louisiana. And it's like you're at the end of the world. You know, you look out and all you see is ocean. But each of these grids is a block number. So they'll say block number such and such. So you can put together several blocks to create a lease. But I just wanted to show you what those grids are. They each have their own number on it, and they're too small for me to see. But you can see that there is a number on it, so they each have their own designation. And again, that's going to be the property description in the oil and gas lease. Again, showing the Outer Continental Shelf all the way out to here. Oops, sorry. I thought this was another interesting map. This is August 1st, 2012, so it's fairly recently. Now again, it's dividing it into 3 different districts: the Western Planning Area, the Central Planning Area, and the Eastern Planning Area. And you can see right away that the majority of leasing, federal leasing, is in the Central Planning Area, because the green is the current active leases. So just by looking at it, you can tell that most of it's in the Central Planning. So this is the Western Planning Area here. Each of these is considered a block. Each of these is considered a block. The total acreage is in each, the total number of leases in each, and then the acres leased. So if we look at acres leased, we can see clearly that in the Western, we have 1,397 number of leases, and the acres leased is 7,907,920. But if you look at Central, we're 22 million acres leased. Contrast that to Eastern, and it's 618,000 acres. So you can see clearly Central Planning has by far the most. So not a lot of activity off the coast of Florida, a great amount of activity off the coast of Louisiana, Mississippi, and Alabama. Also a lot of activity off the coast of Texas in these Western Planning areas. So again, I'd just like to show you these from the website. Now let's look at the OCS leasing program. So the OCS leasing program, well, here's an example. What they have to do is post in the Federal Register. This is called the Federal Register, Volume 77, number 97. This is Friday, May 18th. But what they do is they post, the federal government posts in this Federal Register when the next bids will be accepted. On Wednesday, June 20th, 2012, BOEM will open and publicly announce bids received for the blocks offered in Central Gulf of Mexico Planning Area, sale, etc. And then here it gives the dates. It's going to begin at 9 a.m. Wednesday, June 20th at the Mercedes-Benz Superdome, 1500 Super Bowl Drive, New Orleans, Louisiana. So that's where you can call for these bids. The process is they publish what's called a call for information and nominations request for interest. Now, if the public shows any interest in this, then they'll publish another notice in the Federal Register identifying the property, and from there they'll prepare an environmental impact statement. Now, this is all pre-leasing before it's even put on the bid list. Then they'll have an environmental impact statement, and then they'll publish the final environmental impact statement. And they'll make a decision from that point whether to go forward. If it's going to be too big of a hit on the environment, then they will not put that property on the bid list. If they want to go forward, they'll again publish it in the Federal Register at least 30 days prior to the actual auction. Then what happens next is the Bureau of Ocean Energy Management holds the auctions, and the leases are then issued to the successful bidders. But the bidders must be qualified. So we're going to hold the auction, but I want you to know what the qualifications are for you to be qualified. All right, so it's for qualified bidders only. And in order for you to be considered a qualified bidder, you are the definition is someone that is a citizen of the United States only, or a legal permanent alien, or a U.S. corporation and association. We're not going to have any international bidders in our federal waters. Now the process is, it's a sealed bid. And the minimum bid that you have to put in your envelope is, if it's less than 400 meters, it's going to be $25 per acre. If it's greater than 400 meters, then you're going to have a minimum bid of at least $37.50 per acre. And they'll accept electronic funds transfer, cashier's check, bank check. Now, when I was doing my research online, I did see one bid requirement that was $100 an acre. So you're going to have to read that Code of Federal Regulations really closely to make sure exactly what the minimum bid is. So I saw something that said 37.5, and then I saw something that said 100. So you need to make sure you're up on your Code of Federal Regulations. Now, this bid has to be submitted by 10 a.m. the day before the sale, not the day of the sale, the day before the sale. And then 20% of the bonus has to be included in that bid. Now, in your Code of Federal Regulations, it tells you which types of payments are acceptable. And that's down here, the electronic funds, cashier's check, bank check, etc. Those are the only kind of payments they will accept. So then the bids are open on the sale day and they're read aloud. And then whoever has the highest bid, obviously, they win the oil and gas lease. But it's not an auction like you would think of a typical auction. But it's a bidding process, and it's sealed bids that are presented to the Bureau of Ocean Energy Management. So whoever the highest bidder is would then get the lease. Now, there's something called joint bidding that you can do. Joint bidding is when two or more parties submit a single bid on OCS properties. So they want to jointly operate the property. And so they'll get together and they'll say, hey, let's put one bid in for this property. So parties can join together, and a lot of times this is done because it's so expensive to lease on federal lands, especially if it's in a very competitive area, because there's so many federal acres that are involved. So even though it doesn't look like there's a lot of bonus per acre because there's so many acres, it can be quite large. So a bunch of different companies might decide, hey, let's join in and submit one single bid, and then we'll jointly operate that lease. Now, two or more parties can bid unless they're on what's called the restricted bidder list. These are entities with production of 1.6 million barrels of oil, natural gas, and liquefied petroleum products. These are currently the parties that are on the restricted bidder list. They are ExxonMobil, ConocoPhillips, Shell, BP, Chevron, Petrobras, that's Brazil, Total, that's a French company. Eni is an Italian company, and Petrobras is a Brazilian company, and Chevron. These people cannot join. They cannot do a joint bidding on anything because they're on the restricted bidder list. So, but what they can do is they can partner with someone that's a non-restricted bidder. So they can partner with smaller companies. And the idea is that it's going to give more people the opportunity to participate if they partner with smaller companies, thereby preventing a monopoly. So some people that might not even be able to enter the market, if they partner with an ExxonMobil, clearly they will have the resources they need. But the restricted bidder list is basically that they cannot partner with each other. That would be too great a stress on the competitive market, and so we don't want to allow that. So that's why we have this restricted bidders list. Now, within the joint bidders, they have what they call a mini oral auction. And the way that joint bidding works is that the joint bidders will set the bids. But the first thing they want to do is they want to enter into what they call a joint bidding agreement. Here's an example of that. for OCS lease sale, and it's going to say A, 347, something like that. Eastern Gulf of Mexico, Western Gulf of Mexico, Central Gulf of Mexico. This is very similar to the joint operating agreement. And as you can see, this is what I got off the internet. It does look like a joint operating agreement. Part of what is in it is that they would put the OCS lease number that they were interested in. They would have a confidentiality agreement. They would put their percentages of participation. This would be like, the Exhibit A on the joint operating agreement. What percentage are we each going to get? Then we talk about who's going to pay the bonus and how that's going to be funded, and then we select an operator. So you can see very similar to a joint operating agreement, but it's for an OCS lease, and it's for joint bidding. It's called a joint bidding agreement. So that's what they're going to put into place before they actually bid on the property. Then what happens is all these different parties come together, these different companies that want to jointly develop. They all come together and they have an oral auction. That is, they come together and they orally bid. And once they agree what their bid is going to be, then those bids are prepared for execution, and the bids are then submitted to the Bureau of Ocean Energy Management. Now, if you look in your text on page 145, they have a sample of a completed bid form there. It shows you what the amount of the bid is, and then that is submitted to the OCS, or the Bureau of Ocean Energy Management. And of course, there are going to be other bidders bidding against the joint bidders, but basically the highest bidder is going to get that oil and gas lease through the sealed bid process. Okay, now let's look at the lease term. The primary term, if you're the successful bidder, these are the terms that you're looking at. One is the primary term. It depends on how far that's actually depth. How deep is that well going to be? So it's also how far out into the ocean it is. So I'm going to show you in a minute that depth and distance are sort of the same thing. But your primary term is going to be 5 years if it's greater than 400 meters. And it's going to be 8 years if it's between 400 but less than 799 meters. It's 8 years if it's greater than, and 10 years if it's greater than 800 meters. So a 5-year term, 8-year term, 10-year term, depending on how far in the ocean the particular prospect is. Now the royalty is set at 18.75% or a 3/16 royalty rate. There's a limit to the lease size, and that limit is between 5,000 to 5,760 acres. That's a pretty big lease. And the effective date of the lease is going to be the first day of the month after the bid. So the month after the bid is when the effective date of the lease begins. Now, let's look at then the rental rates. This is how long the lease is going to be, the term of the lease. Now, let's look at what the delay rental rates are. Now, the rental rates are per acre or a fraction thereof, and they're based on water depth and year. So if you can look here, you'll see that from zero to less than 200 meters, if you're in years 1 through 5, it's going to be $7 per acre. In years 6, 7, and 8, it's going to be $14 an acre for year 6, $21 an acre for year 7, and $28 a year acre for year 8. Now in years 9 and 10, obviously you don't have a delay rental payment because it's coming to the primary term. So the rental rates are based on water depth and year. So 200 to 400 meters deep for years 1 through 5, the rental payment is going to be $11 per acre. And then in years 6, 7, 8, it's going to be $22 per acre in year 6, $33 in year 7, $44 in year 8, and then after year 8, there's really no delay rental payments due after that. Now, if the water depth is 400 to 800 feet, it's going to be $11 an acre in years 1 through 5, and then $16 in years 6, year 7, and year 8. And then if it's over 800 feet, it's going to be $11 for years 1 through 5, and then $16 for years 6 through 8. And again, no delay rental on years 9 through 10. So the next thing I want to show you is how this sort of relates to water depth and water depth and meters. So when we're talking about depth, we're also talking about distance from the shoreline. Because if the shoreline is over here, and this is the shallow water, it continues to get deeper and deeper and deeper. And as it gets deeper and deeper, it gets more and more expensive because you have to use different rigs depending on how deep the well is. So for a fixed platform here, that's going to be up to 1,650 feet. 1,500 to 3,000 feet is this compliant tower. And then you've got the floating production system here as it gets further and further out into the deepest part of the ocean. Now you've got these floating systems. But if it's less than 200 meters, it's going to be $7 an acre. If it's with a minimum royalty is something you need to be familiar with, but the federal government establishes a minimum royalty rate so that even if the well is not producing, they're still going to get their royalty. So the royalties are for less than 200 meters, it's 700 feet. It's $7 an acre, I'm sorry. And for greater than 200 meters, here, greater than 200 meters, it's going to be $11 an acre. Now, if it's actually producing, obviously, it's going to be a 3/16 royalty. But I do want to show you that water depth coincides to the distance from the shoreline. So these are the minimum royalty rates depending on how deep the water is. $7 an acre if it's less than 200 meters, and if it's greater than 200 meters, it's $11 an acre. Now, if you have actual production, obviously it's going to be a 3/16 royalty interest percentage of production. So let's look at what we talked about today. What we did was we looked at the introduction, and I showed you that the Outer Continental Shelf is not something we made up in the oil and gas industry. It's an actual geological, physical structure that you can see. I showed you what the continental shelf was, what the outer continental shelf was, and then what international waters are. And then we looked at state ownership under laws and jurisdictions. Under laws and jurisdictions, we talked about whether the state owns it or whether the federal government owns it. And we said if the state owned it, for most states, if it's 3 nautical miles from the shoreline, that's state ownership. Unless you're Texas or Florida, then it's 10 nautical miles, that's state ownership. Then we looked at the laws and jurisdictions impacting this, and that includes the Submerged Lands Act and the Outer Continental Shelf Lands Act. And I told you that the Submerged Land Act was for the states and the other one was for the federal government, the Outer Continental Shelf Lands Act. And then we said that these procedures were codified in Title 30 of the Code of Federal Regulations, Section 250 and 256. And I showed you what those regs actually looked like. And then from there we talked about some more pictures of the Outer Continental Shelf. Then we talked about the OCS leasing process itself. We talked about how they go about putting a property on the bid list, how they publish it in the Federal Register, and then they wait for the public to respond. And if there's a response, then they'll do an environmental impact statement, and then if they decide to go forward, then they'll again put that in the Federal Register so that it can be publicized. The bidding process itself is actually a sealed bidding process. And there's a minimum bid that you have to pay. It's $25 an acre if it's less than 400 meters, and greater than 400 meters is $37.50. You have to submit this by 10 o'clock a.m. the day of the sale, or rather the day before the sale. And you have to include the 20% in the bid that you want to pay as a bonus. And that's, you can pay by electronic funds transfer, cashier's check, or bank check. Then on the day of the sale, the bids are opened. They look at the process of joint bidding. Then we looked at the process of joint bidding, and we said if the parties wanted to submit a single lease, they could join together and submit a single lease. They do this a lot of times because so many acres are included in one block, and so it can get kind of expensive. And then we talked about the restricted bidders list, and if you're on that list, you cannot partner with anyone else on that list. But you could partner with someone that's not on that list, a smaller company. Then we talked about if they are going to bid jointly, then there's this mini oral auction that they have. All the working interest owners get together and they decide what their bid is going to be. Then we walked you through the actual lease terms. If you're the successful bidder, you're going to have a 3/16 royalty. We said it was different primary terms depending on the depth of the water or how far the shore you were from. And the effective date starts the first day of the month after the bid. And so that wraps up this presentation on offshore leasing. I hope this was helpful to you. Are there any questions about this at all? Any questions about offshore leasing? Okay, well that concludes our presentation for today, and I look forward to seeing you in the next webinar.